All right, I'm now recording this breakout room, and so Jamie, the inventor, is here. So let's open up the floor for questions, and if it gets crowded, then we can moderate a little bit. But I would say that we can just probably go right ahead. So Tian Yu, I think you were asking a question, so please proceed.
So will this device be able to put on the balcony?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. It might have cut out on my end.
Because when you introduced the device and you mentioned about to restrict the blood go out and still so there is some blood went in. So how about this work on the balcony muscles?
Yeah, so it will absolutely work for building muscles. As you point out, it is about basically how much blood we let in and versus what we let out. We can actually do this for probably longer than most people would think. It seems to be safe to do such a restriction for up to about 20 minutes. We usually don't come anywhere close to that. But right now, the science is at the point where we understand the efficacy is based on the intensity of that stimulus. So there's a few different ways we can manipulate that, and that's what this device does. Is it works on either end basically. So we can change the way we restrict in terms of the timing, the pressure we use, or we can change the way that we make the muscles contract. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
One thing I would, Simranjeet has a question as well, but one thing I would also point out is building muscle is fantastic, but just as a reminder, Jamie pointed out that this works where the only stimulus provided is through passive use, that is the electrical combined with the blood flow restriction, which may have a lot of really interesting applications in the medical market for either the elderly or for people with muscle wasting or for people that are confined to their bed for a period of time. So those are other applications that I would encourage people to consider. Simran, it's you. Go ahead, ask a question.
Thank you very much for the information, Dr. Burr. It was definitely very interesting. I had no idea that there was even such a remarkable ability for muscle to be gained with blood restriction. So I guess I wanted to better understand the device itself. How is it, I guess, more competent at allowing for muscle to be gained versus simply using a tourniquet and then using, I guess, electrical therapy separately? And the device itself, how does it exactly function? Does it have does it itself shock the patient? And is that being connected to the grid, or would it have a battery system? How would it exactly function?
Yeah, great question. So I will preface this by saying I'm not an engineer, but I'll give you the basics. Essentially, as you point out, the two devices exist in isolation, right? Electrical stimulators are a thing, and blood flow restriction is a thing. Typically, if you were to go to, say, physiotherapy, they would use a relatively light dose stimulation, and they will target a very specific muscle. Depending on how we wanted to use this, if you wanted to grow muscle, for example, let's say you were doing that even to prevent chronic disease like diabetes, because we know that muscle uses blood sugar, you're probably not going to want to focus on a very small muscle mass. And so one of the things that's different about the device is we use a very large patch that essentially we can engage the entire quadricep at one time. So what is unique about the device is exactly as you point out, that the two pieces will talk to each other. We are now working on using biofeedback. So things like sensing muscle oxygenation. There's potential that we may be able to sense the buildup of some of these byproducts I was talking about to titrate if we should be giving more or less of a stimulus. So as the technology advances and as the science advances, we will really look to hone in on what are those optimized zones.
Then may I ask a follow-up question, if that's okay?
Yeah, by all means.
So in terms of, I guess, assessing the level of buildup of waste products in the muscle, how exactly would that be done? Like, would there be, I know lasers can be used, for example, to assess blood oxygenation. Would that be a method, or would there be, direct, I guess, sampling of the blood supply in the area to take a measurement?
Yeah, great question. So you're absolutely right. We can use things like near infrared to measure how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin or myoglobin. So that side is fairly simple and straightforward, to be honest. There's new technology coming out now that does allow sampling of things like blood lactate. So working anaerobically, we expect that would be one of the major markers. But as I said, that still needs to be determined. What is the best thing to measure, and what is related to the greatest outcome? And that outcome may differ depending on your goal. Whether it's preserving muscle mass or leading to strength gain or whatever it might be.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Burr.
You're welcome.
Tim, you had a follow-up question, wondering if you thought that it would cause varicosity.
Yeah, good question. There is some concern, or there certainly was concern when this started, about blood clots, and I guess varicose veins would certainly be part of that as well. It's not something that in a normal healthy person we're actually that concerned with anymore. It actually turns out that the use of blood flow restriction, it causes an anti-fibrinolytic effect, which means you're less likely to cause clots than you would if you didn't have this released into the blood. So from a safety perspective, we now believe if people are appropriately screened, it's fairly safe. In terms of breaking small blood vessels like varicosity, it is possible, but typically we're not going to be using loads, particularly electrically stimulated, that would make that a real concern. So I guess I will say there's two possibilities in the way that this device could go. There could be the at-home type use, which would probably be a toned down version, and also more of a health professional type version, which would be used by trained professionals who understand indications and contraindications to use.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jamie? Now's your chance. And well, okay, probably there will be other chances if people are working on this technology. It's not like we're not going to answer any questions, but you've got Jamie on video right now, so it's a good opportunity to ask all kinds of questions.
I would have a question more about how much has the device been tested for like sort of outcome measures, and also specifically over what kind of time frame. Like how long do these effects last if you're no longer using the therapy? Like will it just, with like normal non-use, it will just go back to the way it was, or will they be lasting, or what sort of outcomes have you measured up until now, and what's the time frame?
Sure. Great question. I appreciate that. Thank you. I hesitate to say this, Evelyn, because oftentimes when the media talks about this, or when we've talked about it in the past, they like to describe it as exercise while sitting on your couch. And for obvious reasons, as a health researcher, I don't promote that. But in some ways, that's not incorrect. So when you ask about what is the time course of these effects, or how long do we expect they'll last, it's very much like quote unquote real exercise. So we believe we're in many ways tricking the body into adapting the way it would have if we'd actually worked out hard. So we expect that the decay of those effects will be pretty similar to if you were able to get into the gym and actually lift heavy weight. On the gain side, if you will, there is actually some evidence that suggests these effects may occur a little bit quicker than we would expect with traditional resistance training. I'll be honest with you, we're not entirely sure why that is yet. But most exercise training studies, I would say, are 8 to 12 weeks. We've actually seen this technology now prove to be effective in as little as 4. It may have something to do with the way muscles are recruited when you send an electrical stimulus through it. Without boring you with the details, it's a different pattern than if the signal comes from your brain.
Right.
So we do have evidence now, both in my lab, we have run a study essentially where we've taken people and used this as a training device over a number of weeks, and we did show outcomes for strength and hypertrophy. We just recently published one where we actually had people for 2 weeks not use one of their legs. And so they would come to the lab and be treated to see if we could stop muscle wasting. And long story short, yes, we can. And in fact, in some people, we actually grew muscle during that period. So.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, Simran, I think you had your hand up first.
I guess what do you see as like the time frame for this progressing? The I guess more answers about how the processes actually function, how the I guess the muscle mass is actually built, and then I guess how long it would take for such devices for both medical and I guess recreational applications to reach market.
Yeah, these are all really good questions. So one of the challenges, I'll be honest with you, that I have in describing this device is exercise is such a potent stimulus, and it is good for so many things that it is almost unbelievable. And so, and I mean that just regular exercise, right? If we could sell exercise as a pill, it would be the world's most effective drug. So when we consider that what we've essentially done is made an exercise mimetic to some extent, it could potentially be effective in a number of different facets. So to bring that back to your question, it sort of depends on what outcome we would like to promote. We've talked so far mostly about muscle hypertrophy or growing a muscle. The stimulus for that is probably different from what it takes to actually increase strength primarily. And there is some evidence that endurance capacity of a muscle is also affected. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to specifically understand those mechanisms and to optimize them. Having said that, we are getting an idea about what works. It's just us nerds need to understand the why so we can optimize it a little bit more.
And when you speak about the impact on endurance and strength, I assume you mean positive. There's not a negative impact based on the device.
Sorry, yes, that's correct. So
Okay,
specifically, my lab has shown, this is with traditional lifting, if you will, but we actually showed that people who trained one leg without blood flow restriction and one leg with, though the loads were totally different, those who used blood flow restriction lifted light, as you would expect. We saw the same gains in strength and everything in hypertrophy over a period of 6 weeks. But what we saw was the group that trained with blood flow restriction, or that leg, it was able to withstand a high force output for longer.
okay.
So we have seen that. And there's also a group in the UK that has shown, even in elite cyclists, we see these changes in fitness, VO2 max, which is the gold standard measure of fitness, that are quite frankly unbelievable, like 5% increase, which would be comparable to blood doping. So we believe that's a totally different mechanism, which is something we're looking into as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burr.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a few questions, more like the business side, I guess you can say. So first of all, so in your head, would it be targeted towards like consumers or like industry, more like health professionals?
Yeah, so I will give you my quick thoughts, and I'll invite Steve to maybe go in on this as well, because I'm a physiologist, not a business person. I could certainly see a market in both, to be honest. I think there is sort of the home use, which, as I said, I think probably needs to be a toned down version for safety, because if you did it wrong, there is potential to hurt yourself here, versus a hospital-based use as well. And I suspect that there are going to be differences in the way that needs to be marketed based on hurdles for approval. Because if something is sold like Dr. Hose, right, that's it's just a thing you do to feel good. And I suspect the claims that will be made about that are very different from those that are medically based.
Right. And so like for the consumer, I'm not sure if you guys have these numbers yet or something, but like price wise, would it be like a heavy, like, or would it be a very pricey product for consumers to buy?
We aren't really at that place
Understand. That's understandable.
right now.
Yeah,
So right now, if you imagine, it's pretty simple electronics as well as, a tourniquet. And, some of the things that Jamie was talking about in his presentation in terms of some enhancements that can be made for the blood flow restriction cuff and the electronics to kind of talk to each other. That is, theoretical sort of now. Although, so if you think about the actual components, I'm fairly certain that a relatively simple device for home use would not be that expensive in terms of material costs and so on. Part of the analysis that in terms of price and so on will be, part of this competition, as it were. A primary reason why we've entered this technology into this competition is because, so far it's not commercialized, and so therefore, not a whole lot of product development, I suppose, has gone into it yet. I think as part of the competition, analyzing the market and looking at it from that perspective, as well as considering things like, Jamie alluded to regulatory concerns. Certainly, if you wanted to, market this via infomercial, the primary regulatory hurdle would probably be just, is it electrically safe? It's not going to burn your house down type of thing. Whereas if you're using it in nursing homes and in hospitals, then, as a medical device, then obviously, the regulatory hurdles are going to be higher, but at the same time, the public good is going to be higher, and, potentially the margins might be higher on a medical device as well than it would be on a consumer product, although the volumes would obviously be higher on a consumer product. And so those are all things that I think need to really be considered. If any of your teams decide to choose this technology for the competition, both for the abstract and eventually for the pitch down the road.
Cool. Thank you for the answer. And also one more scientific question. I'm not in sciences, but so what about I know when you work out, endorphins, all those kind of you get all of the chemicals going, pumping, right? Does this also provide that, or if you can touch on that? I don't know if that question made sense.
Yeah, so kind of like the idea of the runner's high. Typically, I would say most of the research suggests that's actually more of an endurance-based response, the endogenous opioids and everything else, the endorphins. I'll be very honest with you, Eric. When you do blood flow restriction, like lifting light weights with the cuffs on, I say that it's easier because the intensity is lighter. It doesn't feel more fun. It still hurts, right? You work for it. However, when you use electrical stimulation, it does change that. So if you've ever had stimulation done, you can basically keep cranking it up until it becomes very uncomfortable. It actually appears that the use of the cuff at the same time seems to stabilize the muscle, and it's less uncomfortable as a result. So it's not like you leave feeling like you had that big pump, that big workout. Having said that, though, you did metabolic work, and you will feel a little fatigue.
Notice there's several new people in the breakout room. I was wondering if just for anyone that wasn't here before, questions are open-ended. If whenever you hear a pause in the conversation, feel free to jump in with a question. Alternatively, if you would prefer to raise your hand, then I'll call on you specifically.
Would it be okay? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I already asked a few questions. You can go first.
Okay. Yeah, so I just joined. I just wanted some more clarification with this technology. So is the purpose of this to increase muscle tone while you're working out, or is it used more in a recovery state where you're just like in a static position where you're sitting down or just something like that?
Hi, Benjamin. Thanks for the question. That's a great question. To be honest, I think part of that could be a bit of a marketing decision. So one of the things we were talking about before you were here is that though the stimulus is very different, the application of this is very much like any other type of exercise. So, I personally view this as it's probably something that I would see a real application for in those who can't or shouldn't move freely. Right? So let's say you have a joint injury or you're confined to a bed for some reason. Essentially, you could reap all those benefits of exercise without actually having to get up and get underneath weight and do squats or whatever it might be. So I could certainly see a role there. My group is actually right now just publishing a paper on Is there an applicability of using this type of blood flow restriction with elite athletes? As an elite athlete, you're obviously well trained to begin with. So does this add anything on top? The short answer is it appears that there may be some additive effects. They're small, but at the elite level, everything you do is small because you've already made those big gains.
Okay, thanks. And just wondering, like, I don't know thoroughly like how the technology is composed of, but how replicable is this per se to like a different technology? Because I know like there's some compression factors, but like if another company can like build this within like 1 year per se, like just wondering the novelty of this. How novel is it?
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, is it hard to recreate? This is a device that we are patenting. So there should be some patent protection on somebody basically stealing the exact same idea and doing it. But having said that, I mean, the ideas exist, right? Tourniquets are not a new idea. Electrical stimulation is not new. It's the combination and having those devices talk to each other and do it in the right way is really what it comes down to. That's the real novelty here. It's also understanding that the combination of these things produces something differently than either of them would independently. So does that sort of help?
Yeah, sorry. It was a poorly structured question, so I apologize for that.
That's okay. I hope I answered it for you.
Yeah, you did perfectly. I just had one more question because I have another commitment to go to, but in regards to like independent use, because I just looked at like the prototype of it, but I was just wondering how user friendly is it for like, let's say an elderly person to put it on and just do this procedure just at home per se?
I mean, theoretically, it could be push button, right? So you put it on. Typically, what we would do is you actually put a sleeve on your skin. Somebody else had asked earlier about the possibility of varicose veins. When you're squeezing a limb, imagine like having your blood pressure measured. If you really crank it up, you can like cause bruising. So we tend to put a sleeve underneath. We put the cuff on, and then as soon as you hit go, it basically will inflate the cuff and then start sending the signal to shock the muscles. Now, in things that are not my prototype, basically electrical stimulators that exist, most have algorithms built in already. So you can say, I'd like an endurance type stimulus, or I'd like a resistance type. And basically that just changes the length of the train of electrical stimulation and how hard you hit the muscle, and then how long and how often you allow it to relax. So pretty easy to work that into the technology as it is.
Okay, thanks.
I apologize. I didn't see who had their hand up first, but Ali hasn't asked a question yet, so you can go first.
Hi, so this is more of a question for Steve, and it's related to like getting approval. So if you were, sorry, to get this used in a hospital as a medical device, you would need to get like FDA approval and go through those pathways. Have you guys already started looking at those avenues, or is that something you just might want to do in the future?
No, we haven't gone far down that path yet. So it would be Health Canada here, FDA in the United States. But no, unfortunately, I don't have a lot to offer in terms of what's been done so far.
Thank you.
Just for everyone, it's still relatively early stage. You know, there's a whole story and history behind why that is, but that's not overly relevant for this. What you need to know is you know, there's good high quality research behind it. There's an initial prototype, and there's a patent application in the United States. In terms of marketing and development of a actual device for sale, that is something that a licensee or startup company is going to have to control, and we aren't at that stage yet, which is why it's still available for this competition.
If I can, Steve, I will just jump in. Ali, the one little bit I do know in looking at it briefly is that at least in the US, there is the ability to go through and prove that the technology is not significantly different from something else. And the two components can be proven to be not significantly different, which means you can bypass some of that FDA work of proving that you've got a new thing that might be dangerous, because these things in isolation are not dangerous if used correctly. So.
I'll go with Eric, because you're next on my screen.
Yeah, could you go a bit more in depth on like the patents that you are planning and what you have so far?
Sorry, say that again.
Could you go more in depth on like the patent that you
Sure.
have and the patents that you're planning, or because I hear that you don't have one in Canada yet? So
No, we have a patent application. This, you know, the technology originally was filed by the University of Prince Edward Island, and now it's moving over to University of Guelph. So there's, you know, a little bit of administrative background there. There is only a patent application in the United States because, you know, it was a financial decision to do that, to do in one country instead of multiple countries. So there is no patent in Canada. That said, there are multiple types of protection, I suppose, available besides patents, which, you know, is a very interesting thing to look into. The United States is certainly a significant percentage of the market for anything like this. Although we would expect there to be plenty of benefits in Canada as well. In addition to patents, you can imagine things like, you know, actual designs. There's opportunities to file design patents like after an actual device is built. And in fact, design patents can be strong enough that Apple successfully sued Samsung for $1 billion because Samsung's phone looked too much like Apple's phone. And so there's additional protections that would be available to a company that was actually commercializing this. But the core background intellectual property would be this patent application that we have in the United States, which is in the midst of prosecution now. Simran, you had an additional question?
Just one last question before I go. So this is about, I guess, the mechanism of action a little bit. So when the blood restriction is applied, what amount of blood restriction is necessary to get the majority of benefits? Like essentially, what point do we see a plateau in benefits occurring? And does that generally tend to be within what is acceptable and I guess not, you know, dangerous to a variety of individuals? Or, you know, are there overlapping, maybe are there situations where some individuals may not be capable of withstanding that level of blood restriction? Or just generally, how does, I guess, that pan out?
Yeah, great question. So I'll be honest, when we started this work, we as a subfield, we didn't understand what that level was. And essentially everyone took the sledgehammer approach, which meant like 200, 250 millimeters of mercury, which if you've never experienced is not fun. We now understand that is completely not necessary. That would cut off all flow in, all flow out. Now I'd say you're gonna end up somewhere around like 130. It does depend on how big somebody's leg is. It depends on how superficial or deep the vasculature is. But we don't actually have to measure that using ultrasound or anything. We now understand that we can actually do it with the cuff itself. So we can inflate the cuff just like a blood pressure cuff and figure out, we call it the LOP, or the least effective occlusion pressure. And then we take a percentage of that. It's typically about 40 to 80% of the pressure it takes to cut off flow. So for most people, it's not that big a deal. You know when we're squeezing you, but it's not painful per se. Your question about, your part about are the people that we shouldn't be doing this to? I do believe that there are some populations we need to understand a little bit better, particularly those who are really frail. This is not an area that we've gone into yet. If you had the possibility of breaking bones, for example, let's take somebody who's been wheelchair bound for many years, has not been weight bearing on their legs. I would be very careful about inflating a high pressure cuff on a leg that might shatter. people at risk of clotting disease. Despite what I said earlier, we just haven't done that research because it's not ethical. So in healthy people, though, it appears safe, it appears effective, and it's not painful. It's uncomfortable, but most exercise is.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burr.
We have a
We definitely.
We have a question in the chat from Mahak. I was wondering, Mahak, are you able to ask a question? Well, Mahak in the chat asks, what is our primary target market and who are we trying to attract beyond it? Just to repeat, I answered a similar question previously, but you know, the target markets and what is the optimum markets is kind of part of this competition. But the markets that we've envisioned sort of is, again, there's an at-home market for people that want to work on you know, building muscles, or the athletic market or the sports market, as it were. There's also a market for people that are rehabbing injuries, as Jamie said. Maybe you have a joint problem or something, and you want to be able to do work on a particular limb, even though your joints are sore or injured or need more time to heal. And then, of course, there's medical uses for, you know, people that are stuck in bed, people that are in a hospital, people that may have a heart condition, what have you, and don't want their muscles to atrophy. Even people that are, you know, confined in some way to a bed or a wheelchair or anything else. So the markets are varied and wide, and each is a little bit different. And I think that's kind of part of the fun of this competition, is to kind of do a little bit of research, if you will, on each of these and see where the real opportunity lies for potentially commercializing this, and of course impressing the judges at this competition.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'll maybe just add to that too, just to give you some ideas. I think all of those examples that Steve gave are great. Some other ones in a medical setting that may not be obvious right away. Diabetes it is of epidemic levels in the world. And we know that exercise is actually very effective at bringing up blood glucose. So this is something we're working on right now, is understanding how well can we bring down blood glucose without using drugs, by using something like this. We know that exercise, going out and going for a walk, will lower your blood glucose, but many people are not able or willing to do that. So here's a potential opportunity that we could use that in a medical setting. Another example with athletes, for those who have been here for a little while, we talked about, is there a use with elite athletes? It does appear that we can still make them a little bit stronger and a little bit bigger, if you will. But aside from that, we're quite interested in, I work with a lot of elite endurance athletes. So if you're a marathoner, you go out and do a marathon, at some point your joints can only take so much loading. Your legs can only take so much loading. But what if you come back and you sit on the couch or in the training room, whatever it is, and we extend your workout metabolically? So we save your joints, we save all those other things, and we just keep the muscle thinking that it's working. There is accumulating evidence that there may be a role for something like that as well. So I think there's actually, there's a lot of different ways that this could be taken, which, as Steve said, is kind of exciting.
I had another question about the technology. The way that it's built now, I saw like in the pictures that there's like a big patch for the electrical stimulation. And I think you mentioned like it was on purpose, that it's like a big patch so that you cover a lot of muscle. So is it targeting multiple muscles at the same time that are sort of in the same region on like your upper thigh? And is that same patch then also usable on like different body parts? Like, for instance, my lower arm would be smaller than my upper thigh, but are you using then the same distilled patch, or do you need a different one, or how would that work?
Yeah, so your lower arm is smaller than your thigh for now.
Right.
Just kidding. So yes, the way that an electrical stimulator works essentially is there's an in and an out. So it's always paired electrodes, and you have to pass the current through the muscle belly to get it to engage. I had a video that didn't actually come up. I'll see if I can pull that up for you in a second here. but essentially we can make a muscle, you can see it visibly twitch. So when we start engaging somebody, their muscle is kind of doing this as we go. So if we use very small patches and we put the in and the out very close together, we can fine tune to really small muscles. So in fact, we have done forearm before where you put them here and you can have fingers twitching. In the example I showed you in the picture with the quadricep, we didn't want to just get a muscle, we want to get all the muscles. And we can actually engage the entire thigh if we want. We can go right through. You can put the entrance and the exit through the leg instead of down the leg if you want. I will also point out that you don't have to do it just to muscles. You can actually go one step up and target the nerve. You just need a higher voltage. So anything that is connected through that nerve, instead of just starting at the brain and coming down to the nerve and then going to those muscles, you can engage it all. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a question. So I was just wondering, are there any like safety ramifications of this technology? So I have actually tried one of those electrode back massager thing, and then it did feel kind of funny, and then it was a little bit painful after a while. So I was just thinking, because like muscle involuntary twitching, that's kind of like a seizure. So this is almost like a controlled seizure, if I may. I was wondering if there might be any like damages potentially to tissues as well as to like the person.
Yeah, good question. I mean, overall, electrical stimulation is relatively safe. Absolutely agree. It can be uncomfortable, and particularly when we use a high voltage stimulator like we do in my laboratory. Like I could make your leg, I could make your knee actually extend if I wanted to. It doesn't feel nice. But having said that, the level of the muscle tissue, it would take a very high voltage to cause real damage. So, I mean, that's obviously a controllable feature. We wouldn't offer that ability. In terms of blood flow restriction, there are some things we need to be aware of, and we talked about some of these already. In terms of clotting, people who are at risk of clotting diseases, we need to think about safety in people's bone structure. If they have osteopenia or osteoporosis, we'd be very careful. But again, there are now pretty clear guidelines on who should and who should not use blood flow restricted exercise. There are certain drugs that interact as well, but like any medical device, that would be the sort of thing that, you know, it would either be a licensed practitioner that is allowed to use this, or it would be sort of a toned down version where it would be very hard to hurt yourself with it.
Yeah, that was the point I was trying to get at, because I think earlier I was in the breakout room earlier, but you did mention that this is potentially could be marketed towards end consumers to, I guess, like build muscles at home. So I was just thinking, like, if it's like a medical device, then obviously people who are at home, they can't use it. But then if it's not a medical device, then is there any like possibility of like getting hurt? But yeah, I think I understand it better now. Thank you so much.
Yes, and I'm certainly not a business person, but I could see those marketing plans would probably be very different as well. So if it's a medical device, the cost to buy a device, because you would be selling less, would probably be higher, and the marketing is probably on the consumables, as opposed to if it's a home use, then you're probably selling many of them at a cheaper price, and you sell it once.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah. So this is probably just because I missed the earlier part of your discussion, but you mentioned there's some populations you have studied this particular process in. Which populations have you studied that are not just like kind of that average healthy person?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, I don't know if you come from a physiology, kinesiology background, but we do tend to study university-aged, healthy people. And part of that is because we need to prove that it's safe and effective there first.
Yeah.
So the large majority of the work from my lab and others has been done in exactly that population. I actually don't think that's necessarily a negative, because in some ways, they are the least likely to actually show a change because they're already physically active. It's a baseline effect, right? If you're starting at a very low level, your capacity for change is much higher. And we still see those changes in those people. We were actually just starting a study with diabetic patients when COVID hit. Yeah, so we haven't been in the lab for a few months, and it's challenging because that's a high risk population to bring back into the lab until COVID is sorted out. But having said that, I can tell you we have pilot data on healthy people that we can indeed affect blood sugar levels. And that's a tough thing to do because they already have good control. They're not diabetic, right? So we hypothesize the effect will be even greater in somebody who sees much larger swings.
Makes sense. Thank you. Yeah. Can I add on a question there?
Shoot.
Yeah. So, in terms of for instance, the blood sugar control, or if there's another application that we were talking about, I guess it's like hypertrophy muscle. Are there thresholds for activation that are necessary, that have been validated in terms of being able to use those specific protocols to achieve these outcomes that you're saying?
Yeah. So,
or do we just kind of make it up?
No, that's a good question. When we started doing this, I'm not sure if you're here when I said it before. When we as a subfield started with restriction pressures, we went over the top because all we knew is we wanted to cut off flow. So we used the highest pressure we thought was safe. We've backed away from that now because now we understand those pressures only need to be 40 to 80% of the pressure it takes to occlude flow. When we started with the electrical stimulation, essentially there was two groups in the world doing it. There was mine and there was a group in Japan, and we approached it in different ways. My group took the sledgehammer approach, where we said, we're going to shock you as hard as you will let us, essentially, because that's all we can ethically do, right? We'll say, we're going to keep turning it up until you tell us that is uncomfortable. And quite honestly, I sort of like the real world applicability of that, because if I ask you to do this to yourself, or even if a technician is doing this in a hospital setting, you can't really go higher than that, right? And you will self-limit. So we know that at that level, it works. The group in Japan did something different, and we've started doing this in a research setting where they matched it to a measured output. So they actually had people kick and said, what can you kick? And then they stimulated the muscle and said, how close did we get to that? Does that make sense so far?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And so it turns out you only need to be going at about 15% of their maximal voluntary kick. So that's relatively low. The challenge with prescribing it that way is that few people have access to knowing what they're capable of and what the stimulation is. But I think if you go like, hey, on a scale from 1 to 10, put it at about this, you'll get pretty close.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know.
Steve and Jamie, I got a question. I'm not sure to direct it to which one of you guys. So I know, Jamie, you mentioned earlier the fact that the tourniquets, or the device that you use to limit the blood flow, is not a new idea, and the electrical stimulation is definitely not a new idea. So, and you mentioned that your technology is patented. So what is patentable about the technology? Is it just the combination of both, or there is something else in the IP that
Yeah, it's basically the combination of the two ideas done at the same time on the same muscle produced a result that was unexpected and would not have been anticipated from someone just saying, well, I'm going to take this and add this. So we think it's patentable, and we're in the middle of, arguments with the US Patent Office. So we're going back and forth, and there's certainly no guarantee that it will become an issued patent, but we think our arguments are strong. And in terms of, other people having done things like this before, in terms of the literature, the published literature and the patent literature, we think that Jamie was the first one to do this. He alluded to a group in Japan who did something pretty similar about a year after Jamie did, which is really nice confirmation. But Jamie's patent application was filed before the Japanese paper came out. So, we feel pretty good that it will end up with an issued patent based on our review of the literature. But yeah, it's not a guarantee. And I had a comment on the side that's from someone saying they saw something similar, and it's possible that there's something else similar out there. But if we are in a position where we're able to get that issued patent in the U.S., that gives us a very strong position in terms of legitimacy and the ability to go forward and hopefully commercialize this product in partnership with whatever company is going to actually do it, whether that's a startup or some other pre-existing company.
Thank you. Thank you both.
I think somebody else has a question.
Yeah, so I had two questions sort of related to the patent question. One was, I think you mentioned before that originally the patent was filed by the University of PEI and then it was transferred to the University of Guelph. I was wondering what the reason for that was.
Mainly because Jamie used to work at University of PEI,
so it just moved with the researcher.
and now he doesn't. And so PEI found it difficult to put a lot of effort and attention into the product when the person that they would rely upon to consult and so on was somewhere else. So they thought they'd have a better chance of it going forward if it was moved to the location where the inventor is. And Jamie's, you've been at Guelph now for 4 or 5 years at this point, right?
Yeah, 5 years now.
Yeah. So
cool. So the other question I had was, I think early on you mentioned that indeed the combination is the novelty, right? But also that you sort of envisioned that later on, like the parameters that would need to be set for like both the cuff and maybe the electrical stimulation, that you could measure other things like blood lactate or maybe other physiological measurements. I understand that that's more a vision than something that's currently actually possible.
Yeah, so I'll get Steve to correct me if I'm wrong on how the patent works exactly. These things are now proving possible. So we do measure things like blood oxygen levels, muscle oxygen levels regularly in my lab. It's really just a matter of having it communicate with the existing prototype. So it can be done now. I know that when we originally put together the patent, those kind of things were put in. In the back and forth in examination, I don't know what's still included, if those were in or dropped, to be totally honest. But I do imagine there is a lot of room for this type of technology to grow. So like many things, it would likely have a patent portfolio, because as you got better at things, you just keep adding things to it.
If nobody else wants to interrupt, may I? You probably covered some of this already, but I know generally for FES, there's not significant concerns with muscle breakdown, electrolyte disturbance, that kind of thing. With the combination of the two, is there any concern for electrolyte disturbances, rhabdomyolysis, other things with, I guess, very intense muscle contractions?
Yeah. So you sound like you have a bit of a background. If you're interested, we've actually had a strong debate in the scientific literature just about rhabdomyolysis. For those who are not familiar, it's essentially when you really overdo it with a muscle, you can cause that muscle cell to explode and release its contents, which can cause death, actually, in a severe case. It is very rare, even with high load exercise. There are a few predisposing factors that could cause that. There is no indication that it has ever happened in a healthy person, and never with electrical stimulation. So I do not believe that that is a big concern, but we have seen it in essentially when blood flow restrictions started. There was a group in Sweden that comes to mind, hockey players who said, hey, a little bit is good, let's do a whole lot and just keep going, which was not a wise decision. So there's only a few cases, very rare.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
I guess you're combining two different technologies. So how do you decide, how do you come up with the optimum formula between like how much to stimulate versus how much to restrict? Is that just trial and error, I guess? Yeah,
good question. I think it really depends on what your goal is. So I'll give a rather simple example, I guess. Most people who have visited the gym are probably familiar with the idea of you can train for muscular endurance or you can train for muscular strength. And the big difference in those two prescriptions would be if you want to get stronger, you should lift really heavy things a few times, right? You go in and lift something 3 times that really puts you at your maximum, that will cause you to get stronger. If you go in and lift something that's relatively light about 50 times, you will gain muscular endurance. So in regards to how we actually cause the exercise stimulus, we can control those factors in the same way. So you can either send a shock that goes like blip, 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 or you can send one that goes like blip, blip, right? And you're going to get a different adaptation as a result. In terms of the restriction, that is more, we tend to control that more. It's either during the exercise or in the period of rest after the exercise. We have pressures pretty dialed in now. We now understand there's no point. More isn't necessarily better. So yes, we can play with those different things, and it's the combination of how we do those and combine it that will change the outcome. Is that helpful, Mark?
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Can I ask you a logistical question? Oh, I don't want to interrupt, Mark. Did you have another question there? From just because we're coming up on, I think, 6 o'clock soon. If we want to reach out to you for more questions, who's the best person to contact?
Yeah, I am certainly happy to take questions if they deal with the technology. I will put, once I figure out how to get onto the chat here, I'll put my email address right onto the chat.
That would be great. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, I can do that as well. So if you have more questions about the IP, then talk to me. If you have more questions about the technology, you can contact Jamie.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? It's we seem to have hit a lull. Maybe everyone's questions have been answered, and people can go away and think about it and see whether they want to join the competition or not. But I'll give everyone an extra 20 seconds here in case they come up with something. But otherwise, I'll say thanks very much for all of your attention and your time, and which we appreciate greatly. And thank you also to Jamie for your time this afternoon. And I would close it, and the recording will be available if anyone wants to refer to it, or if anyone wants to show it to anyone else in the event that you're assembling a team. Well, great then. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.